In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. This is, of course, the sermon that goes with the Eucharist for Trinity Sunday. And in the Eucharist, we heard the Gospel reading from the very end of St. Matthew's Gospel, Matthew chapter 28. Jesus gathers his 11 disciples as they are together. I've got them here on my stole with St. Paul as well, the 12th of the apostle that was chosen by God to go to the Gentiles. But what Jesus does in that story is to take these men and send them out into the world. Matthew's Gospel is the Gospel that we are focusing on in this liturgical year. We've been reading it since the beginning of Advent, and Matthew focuses very much on this idea of Jesus being a very Jewish Messiah. Matthew, if you remember, right at the very beginning of the Gospel is one who's got that spectacular list of names, the begots, as they're often known, as the entire genealogy of Jesus is laid bare. But the point of the exercise is that Jesus is, in fact, for Matthew, the rightful heir to the throne of Israel. He is, indeed, the King of the Jews. And so that idea comes to the fore in the nativity stories that Matthew tells us about, focusing on Joseph, who is the heir to the throne itself, and then moving on to focus on Herod and those wise men who come looking for the King of the Jews. And as Matthew works through his Gospel, it becomes apparent that Jesus is the Messiah. He's the King of the Jews. He's also, as I've said to the St. Giles congregation before, the new Moses, giving a new law, a new interpretation of what it is to live as God's people on the Sermon on the Mount. And then, of course, Matthew focuses very firmly on this idea of Jesus as the Messiah who dies on the cross. Again, that idea, are you the King of the Jews, is there. And the Jewish people are surrounding him. They're the ones who bring him to crucifixion, it has to be said. But Jesus dies a very Jewish Messiah. But then right at the very end of this very Jewish Gospel, written for a community of Christians from a Jewish background, Jesus sends his disciples out into the world, the whole world, the Gentile world as well. And he gives them what's known as the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all nations. Don't just stick to your own people, he says. Go out into the whole world, into every nation. And baptize them, he says, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And those words, of course, have been echoing down the centuries. These 11 men, and Paul and others like them, went out into the world and they converted the entire world. The fact that we, 2,000 years later, in this period of lockdown, are worshipping the Christian God in Wrexham is a symbol of just how much they believed those words of Jesus and how much they lived them and took them out into the world. But also, those words are very special for another reason as well. It is, of course, Trinity Sunday today, and today we celebrate this idea of God in three persons, as Father, as Son, and as Holy Spirit. And those words, of course, come directly from the mouth of Jesus, as reported by Matthew. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, words that come from Jesus himself. And those words, of course, remind us that right at the very centre of our faith, we believe that God is revealed as Father, as the Creator, as Son, as Jesus, and as the Holy Spirit, the life force of God that goes out to create and that fills our entire being with life and light and love. But we also celebrate something else today, as well as the way that we see God. We believe that this is how God truly is in God's self. In eternity, there is always and has always been and always will be Father and Son and Holy Spirit. And people have said it's almost like a great dance of love, that these three dance together in eternity. This idea of dancing is one that we have taken up in this church. Normally on Trinity Sunday, normally I say because it's actually quite a strange thing to do, the 9:30 congregation, will gather around this altar and we will dance slowly around the altar. All of us linking hands to celebrate this love that we believe is right at the very centre of our faith. It's a very powerful moment and one that I regret not doing. And despite the fact that Laura and Thomas are here, I'm not going to ask them to hold hands with me and shuffle around the altar. Sorry, I've just had this wonderful look from Laura. Fortunately, the camera's on me and not on her. But no, this isn't something that maybe we're going to recreate today. But for those of you who've experienced that, that is a very powerful moment. This idea of a movement, a dancing, a fellowship right at the very centre of God. Of course, we live in a world today that is very deeply divided in all sorts of ways. We see this in the issue of race that is once again rearing its head in the United States, but of course affects us all. But if we see God as Father and Son and Holy Spirit as this great community of love that dances at the very centre of creation in eternity, then we realise that we are all in this together. We are truly all in this together. That what we see in Father, Son and Holy Spirit is not something that excludes. It's not something where two go off and leave the other. It is a perfect love that unites creation from the very beginning and that goes out into the world and that unites us and everything around us. So right at the very centre of our faith, we take these words of Jesus, Father, Son and Holy Spirit, and we see that this is truly what Christians believe in. It's an idea that's very difficult in some ways to get your head around, and people always rather dread Trinity Sunday. And you will notice that James hasn't volunteered to preach on Trinity Sunday, although he tells me that he's preached on Trinity Sunday for the last 3 years. It's something that you get the student on placement to do, of course. Why don't you preach on Trinity Sunday? Because I'm sure you have more up-to-date knowledge than me, is the ruse that is usually used. However, it's a great privilege to be able to preach on this Trinity Sunday as we come to this very centre of our faith. We see God as Father, as Son and Holy Spirit dancing right at the very centre of creation, of eternity, but also inviting us also into that love. And that, of course, is what this great commission of Jesus to the apostles is all about, sending them out into the world. In this time of lockdown, that's not quite as obvious as it might be. We are still talking to one another, but we are being the church in a different way. But still, we know that we are united in love and of faith. And we are united in love and faith with all the baptized everywhere. Not only just across the world, but also going back to all the centuries. We are also united in baptism and in faith and love with all the Christians who will believe in God because of our words and our actions and our deeds. One final thing about that gospel reading. Jesus ends with a promise. And remember, I am with you to the end of the age. So wherever you are listening to this, whether you are listening to it with family and friends, or whether you are alone, remember that Jesus is always with you, and that where he is, there is God, there is Father, there is Holy Spirit, and there is Jesus also, the Son. Because in our Christian faith, we are never alone. We are always surrounded by the God who made us and who loves us and who came to save us and calls us to join in that great dance of all eternity. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.